Rachel, Erin, hello. I was about to say good morning. Good morning and also good evening. How are you both?
Doing well, thanks. How are you?
Doing good too. Doing good too. Rachel?
Great. There's lots of excitement still in Liverpool, as you can imagine.
We're starting these films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and just to tell us a little bit about their work profile, the kinds of things that they work on in their research. So would you mind doing that, please?
Sure. Rachel, did you want to start or should I?
Um, we should have talked about this, shouldn't we? Why don't
I quite like leaving it for my contributors to decide.
All right. Well, I can go ahead. I can
Great.
be the brave pioneer woman, I guess.
Thank you.
So I'm Erin McCarthy. I am currently lecturer in digital humanities at the University of Newcastle. But my work really explores sort of the material forms that texts take in the 16th and 17th centuries. So I just had a book come out with Oxford University Press called Doubtful Readers, and that book is about how publishers sort of translated and marketed poetry to this kind of new print readership. And so it really starts kind of towards the end of the 16th century and then takes off through the 17th century. I'm also finishing up a monograph based on my work for the research project at the National University of Ireland in Galway, where I worked from 2014 to 2018. So we're writing a joint authored monograph right now about the reception and circulation of women's writing, particularly in manuscript miscellanies. And what's cool about that project is that it's meant to provide kind of a quantitative account of reception and circulation. And so it's informed by just thousands of manuscripts, which is great. And if you're interested in the project at all, our database launched in Galway in January. So you can check that out at research.nuigalway.ie. And I'm actually, fingers crossed, hoping to start a new project next year on manuscript description, what I've been kind of casually calling Bowers for manuscripts. It might actually be Gaskell for manuscripts. Or McCarthy for manuscripts, I guess. But it's that sort of book, kind of principles of bibliographic description and ways of working with manuscripts, particularly from the early modern period.
Thank you very much. Rachel, before I hand over to you, may I just unpack some of that?
Sure, go for it.
Just work through some of that. So we're pitching these films to any interested audience. So I'm just thinking about whether we might revisit some of those amazing ideas, if that's all right, Erin. I mean, there's a really fascinating continuity through your work in that attention to shifts from manuscript to print culture. So I suppose just clarifying for our audience that when we talk about manuscripts, we're talking about what I'm doing right now, which is taking notes by hand of the things that you're saying. So a handwritten literate culture as against the emergence of print in the late 15th century. And you're thinking about the boundaries between those two worlds. So later in this conversation, I might ask you to tell us more about what you mean by translating manuscript writing for a print readership. That's really fascinating. And then the second project, again, just give some context for the audience. Feminists have been rewriting literary history since at least the 1980s and probably before, but please do correct me if I'm wrong, but I suppose one of the important correctives of the project you've worked on is that feminist reclamations of women's writing have tended to focus on individual women. And what you have been showing us is the importance of this quantitative, essentially creating a kind of census of women's writerly labour.
Yes, so that's part of it. And we actually have shared what we think is the most comprehensive list of women's writing pre-1700 on our website. But the other thing that we're doing is kind of not turning away from the project recovery, but maybe shifting the focus from recovery, where, from the 80s forward, it was a lot about just finding women's writing. Yeah. There was that Twitter thread a few weeks ago about, what's the most annoying question someone could ask about your discipline? And I was part of a cluster that was things along the lines of like, well, did women even write then? Or like, but was it any good? And this was, Danielle Clark and Lizzie Scott Bowman. So we do still have those questions, but I think what the research project did that was really innovative was sort of saying, like, yes, we know now that there were, you know, like 7,000 women writing. Let's find out who was reading it and what they thought about it and what it meant to be a woman writing in the period. So it's a little bit of a different emphasis. It's sort of taking as given that, you know, yes, there were women writing and there were a lot of women writing. But like, what did people think about it?
Yeah.
So that's what we're writing about now.
Thank you. So shifting away from recovery of writers to a kind of reception history of readers. Yeah, fascinating. And then finally, Rachel, I promise I will come to you in a sec, but again, just to make sure I've understood the third project, which sounds very exciting, and we should definitely call it McCarthy and not Bowers. But could you unpack for us a little bit what you mean by manuscript description?
Sure. So it's kind of turning to a more bibliographical focus as opposed to a purely sort of literary or interpretive project. And it's kind of nice that you had Sarah on yesterday, because Sarah is interested in the same kinds of work. So we have really well developed and you know, at times contested conventions for talking about print features in sort of a standardized way that people can understand, and you can pick up someone's, you know, description of, say, Shakespeare's First Folio, and you can probably at least understand it. You might disagree in the exact way it's described, but at least, you know, the conventions of describing a printed book bibliographically are pretty well set at this point. And then there's just some sort of, you know, arguing around the edges about, like, well, how should you write a collation formula? So that is, you know, describing the structure of the binding. There are a few different ways to do it.
Yeah.
But there's no such standard for manuscripts yet, at least not in the early modern period. So there are ways of talking about the structure of medieval manuscripts and for talking about their paleographical details. There's been more work, I think, in sort of continental languages, so Italian and French, but there hasn't really been a systematic way to deal with Renaissance English manuscripts. I can't believe I use the word Renaissance. I almost never do. But anyway, I think I'm deep into grant writing mode. I think that's what it is. So one reason I think this is challenging, and so I'm doing a bit of writing now about, like, why exactly this gap in the scholarship exists. I think there are a few reasons for it. One is that a lot of English bibliographical methods were developed for dealing with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare didn't leave behind many manuscripts. And so the scholars who were interested in recovering what Shakespeare was writing about weren't all that concerned with manuscripts. There's a quote, I think, from Greg, who just kind of says offhandedly, like, oh yeah, and everything I've said here applies to manuscripts too. It's like, oh, okay. But the other thing that is, I think, more challenging about early modern English manuscripts in particular, and that I think has sort of slowed down work to date, is that, you know, after the emergence of print in the late 15th century, you have far more literate people, and you have far more people who have access to different kinds of texts. And suddenly they're creating their own manuscripts, just like you're creating your own manuscript right now by taking notes. And so how do you begin to describe that? You know, it's one thing to describe a beautiful, you know, illuminated manuscript that was created by a professional scribe. But, you know, what do you do with just the, you know, sheets of paper that someone folded up and, like, stitched together and scribbled on? How do you begin to describe that? And so that's what my next project is about. And it's sort of testing all of the descriptive systems and seeing sort of where they break, and then going, okay, this is somewhere where we need to go in and, like, do a little bit more theoretical thinking.
Yeah, thank you. And you referred there to our film with Sarah Werner. I think that's film number 50 for anyone who wants to go and look at that. And as you say, you're now continuing that focus on the textual object as a thing, rather than thinking about the text itself as a kind of something which has no material existence, but an attention to the material reality of the thing. And so, as you say, structure is really important. Kinds of letter shape, of font, choices of letter size, where
Ownership.
on the page, where on kind of the page architecture the writing appears. These are the kind of things you're thinking about, right?
Yes, exactly. And also things like, you know, ownership marks. If you've seen the her book hashtag on Twitter, you know, like there's lots of evidence of people owning books, and we don't necessarily know a lot about those people, but you know, what do we do with this evidence, and what does it mean, and how can we use it to make sense of what's inside those books?
Perfect, thank you. And you've given us lots of reasons why scholars tend to forget about manuscript culture, but I also wonder if teleology is another issue. So this idea that print culture happens and therefore manuscript culture is in the past is a real problem. And the last thing I'll say, just for listeners who might be wondering who Greg is, that sounds very informal reference to a fellow scholar, but Greg is, that's his surname, and W.W. Greg, hugely important early 20th century textual scholar, but as you're showing us, has absolutely embedded ways we think about text for good and for ill. Erin, thank you very much. Rachel, you've been sat there very patiently, and we will come back to all the ideas Erin's already introduced to us. But would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your work?
Sure. I'll try to sound as clever as Erin, but that won't happen. My name is Rachel Willie. I'm Reader in Early Modern Literary Studies at Liverpool John Moores University. And I guess my research has kind of meandered in various ways. I started off very much concerned with transmission and legacies and memory. Would you like me to close the window? There's a builder who is roofing next door, and it's getting a bit loud here, so excuse me.
No worries. So meandering research. I mean, I'm already interested in that idea.
Yeah. So I started off considering, I guess, with a frustration actually about the way in which our mode of study is organised, and wanted to break down boundaries, such as particularly periodisation. So my first book was on drama during the Civil War period, a period which traditionally is seen as a place where the playhouses are closed, nothing happens. And I was interested in partly in the relationship between text and performance, but also the ways in which drama itself and how it was transmitted really played to this idea that no drama existed. When we know from all the evidence this really didn't happen. There was a proliferation of print, of drama in print, but there are also some examples of performances taking place. So I was interested in the way in which a royalist discourse becomes mapped onto these pieces, even though they're not necessarily royalist, and the restoration stage itself is not this homogenised royalist monolith that we are led to believe. And then after that, I co-edited with Kevin Clean and Helen Smith the Oxford Handbook of the Bible in Early Modern England, which when Kevin invited me to co-edit it with him, I was slightly surprised, because I didn't think I worked on religion. But when I came to revise the thesis for publication, I realised that there was a lot of religion in there, but obviously because it wasn't my primary focus. And to that I contributed a chapter on psalm singing and embodiment, which sort of led to a couple of other projects. The first is I'm currently the principal investigator with Emily Murphy at York. Hi, Emily. On Soundscapes in the Early Modern World, which is a huge network of scholars from all disciplines, and we're thinking about sound. Basically, what do we understand by soundscape? It's one of these big words which is dropped into criticism quite a lot, and it has been theorised, but it's also used in quite a woolly way. So we're kind of, the central hook is what do we understand by soundscape, but I'm thinking particularly in relation to hearing, reading, and the material text, and how this all connects. I've also recently submitted to Routledge with Gabor Galari in the French department, modern language department at Aberystwyth, an edited collection on travel and conflict. And to that I contributed an essay on Afroben's Emperor of the Moon, which segues with the next monograph project, which is on imaginative responses to the moon in the 17th century, or the very long 17th century, because I steal a bit into the 16th century as well.
Woman in the Moon, Woman in the Moon. That's my John Lilly heckle.
Indeed, yes. Yeah, I'm wanting to start with The Woman in the Moon and Robert Greene's Planet of Machia and those kinds of texts.
Wow.
And then finish probably with, I haven't quite made up my mind yet, but either a translation of some work by Sir de Bergerac, or Samuel, what's his name? The Elephant in the Moon. But yeah, it's The Elephant in the Moon. So yeah, but I mean, I found what I thought was being a nice little contained project, because I got a little bit of sense for Francis Godwin's Man in the Moon, partly because of the way in which he discusses sound, has kind of grown into this enormous kind of many tentacle project, which is quite exciting, but at some point I need to bed it down into something coherent.
That is super exciting, thank you. Okay, lots for us to revisit there. Again, just for listeners' benefit, periodization might be an unfamiliar word to some listeners, so the way in which we parcel up and separate off bits of historical time. So just as Erin and I were talking about manuscript and print culture sort of being weirdly separated in retrospect, although they were absolutely live in interlocked forms at the time. So you're pointing us to the way in which we quite aggressively separate off moments of time, as if everyone's resetting their wristwatch. And so I guess drama at the beginning of the Civil Wars in the British Isles is a really good example of that, in 1642, we're relatively clear that most of the playhouses, if not all the playhouses, get shut down. But that does not mean that drama itself, performance itself, both on page and as a performance medium, stops. And I guess for one thing, I'll ask you to unpack, Rachel, because it's especially fascinating. Coming out of soundscapes in the early modern world, you talked about hearing a material text. So you seem to be proposing there, early modern audiobooks, and I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, I think the person to really ask about this is Jennifer Richards, who's written a really fantastic book, which I think will completely change the way in which we understand the ways in which people read.
We're hoping to get her for a film in the next few weeks.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, yeah, and just the basic premise that obviously literacy. Yes.
Oh, snap.
Just the I guess the kind of basic premise that reading aloud was the most dominant mode of engaging with text in the early modern period. And I mean, this obviously raises all sorts of questions about literacy, which have been answered or not answered by various people. But I really love this idea about the orality of text, which Jennifer Richards is really working with in her writing.
Thank you very much. So one way we might think about connecting the various work that you're talking about, in one of the ways might be gender, and this might be a problematic question, but are there ways in which people are given different kinds of access to text via these kind of multimedia forms we've been exploring? So manuscript, print, but also oral forms of literacy. And might that itself be something worth thinking about from the perspective of both social status, education, and gender? That's a very big open question.
I don't want to be the first to speak again. I do have ideas, but I worry that I'm dominating.
Well, so that's question number one, and so we can let that percolate if you like. And Erin, you're absolutely allowed to be the first person to speak if you want to be. That's fine. I suppose the second question I'm wondering about is the idea that Erin raised at the start of translating manuscript texts to print readers, and Rachel's now introducing. I mean, in some ways, question number two is basically question number one, but with different words. But I suppose question number one is specifically about gender. Question number two is about that process of translation between media, right? Between different kinds of ways of mediating, communicating, not just words, but the ways in which words are physically take physical form as sound waves, handwriting, or print in this period. So yeah, can we do something with either of those nexuses, please?
Yeah, I'm now thinking also about the role of error in all of this. So John Donne's manuscripts being the obvious case in point, that how many exist with different words involved. So yeah, I guess are you asking a question more about sort of communication more broadly, how we engage with the material text?
I'm just wondering where your brains go when we kind of pull those things together. I definitely don't have a specific answer in mind.
Well, I can start if that would be helpful. So, I mean, my sense is that men and women had, and I've actually argued this, men and women had broadly similar taste in texts when they had access to them.
Yeah.
But I think in some cases, women's access to text was to a certain degree, and not to the degree that I think sometimes we have allowed ourselves to believe, mediated by the men of their acquaintance. So you see a lot of examples of women, either getting poems from their, husband or brother or cousin who was at court, or Constance Aston Fowler writes to her brother and asks him, send me my verses because send me some good verses, or I need some for my book. Paraphrasing badly, I think, but I've been reading Noah Millstone's book on manuscript pamphlets lately, and he has this great quote from Brianna Harley, who asks to be sent the latest speeches from Parliament. Which, I mean, can you imagine, like, writing and asking, like, please send me some government documents? But that was the news of the day. So of course, it does make a kind of sense. So I think women were interested in these texts. I think they weren't always sort of in the places where they could readily get their hands on them. But then when they did, they were interested in exactly the same things. I mean, when you look at, the poems that women transcribe of Donne's, they go for the exact same things. And you see these critics from, particularly the 19th century, let's blame the 19th century, sometimes into the 20th century, going like, ooh, that's not very ladylike. She wouldn't be interested in that. And it's like, well, of course. I mean, like, these women aren't any different from women now who can, watch, I don't know, trashy Seth Rogen movies and laugh at them and sort of be disgusted, but also, like, think it's funny. So I think, I guess the answer to your question would be yes and no. I think Rachel probably has some interesting things to add, because I think song is where something really interesting happens, that women pick up these verses through the medium of song. Yes.
Right.
Gosh, I really need to be closer to my books.
Sorry, it's like an arms race. Hey! Rachel, do you want to add something there about song or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to be able to, but this is on my to-read pile rather than my have-read. But it does look an amazing book, and yeah, Katie Larson's work on this is definitely a place to look at. I guess I'm also thinking about Erin's point about how men mediate women's, but also the way in which men package women's engagement with text. So if we think about all of those references to women reading romances, as though this is something that only women do, and the extent to which our reception of women's reading is very gendered and belies how it actually happens.
Yeah. I just finished a piece on women's reading in the North American colonies. And I have a couple of great quotes from, like, grumpy Puritan preachers, like, they keep reading plays, it's ruining their brains. But, obviously they were interested in those plays, and they were getting access to those plays, whether or not, Cotton Mather liked it.
And it's something which carries on right the way through. So even in the early 19th century, you get, why are these women reading these novels? The way that texts which are seen as somehow worth reading are presented as stuff that men read, whereas flighty narratives are things which only women read, when we know that that's simply not true. But also the way in which it erases the very detailed engagement with scientific method and learning and natural philosophy which women are doing. I mean, even writers such as Margaret Cavendish, it's only been in the last few years that she's been rehabilitated from being the mad Madge who annoyed the Royal Society when she visited them in the 1660s.
And rehabilitated as
someone who wasn't as crazy as they thought she was. I mean, her natural philosophy and her philosophical tracks are only really being taken seriously, I think, in the last 10 years. And it's great to see. And Anne Conway as well is seen as very much a marginal voice, whereas if we look at her correspondence, she's one of the key thinkers, I think, of the late 17th century. The way that women get written out of that narrative.
Yeah, and what's exciting is seeing that work being undone now, that work of suppression being undone. Yeah, thank you. So we've mentioned a number of resources already. So again, for our readers' benefit, on our website, we have a resources page with each film. So if you come out of the film, look down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see some resources, and we'll make sure that everything that Erin and Rachel are mentioning will end up there, including their own work, of course. So Erin, Rachel a minute ago mentioned error. I think it was Rachel. Forgive me if I got that wrong. But you've just published a book called Doubtful Readers. What is a doubtful reader?
So Doubtful Readers actually alludes to the note at the end of Amelia Lanier's Salve Deus Rerum. And it's called To the Doubtful Reader. And in this note, she explains that the title of the book came to her in a dream. But the reason that I really liked there were a few reasons I liked being able to name the book after Lanier, or in allusion to Lanier. One is just, like I named the book after the one major case study on a woman in the whole book. So it's Shakespeare on one side and Donne on the other, and it gets named for Lanier, which feels slightly subversive. But the other thing is that Lanier's book, I think, shows a real awareness of audience. And I think it was probably when I was writing, gosh, maybe not even that chapter, maybe the thesis chapter that eventually evolved into the book chapter, that I started really thinking seriously about reading and reception and targeting audiences. Because of course, Lanier's book famously is half prefatory material. And so, some scholars said like, she's just trying to get patronage. Maybe, but if she was just trying to get patronage, there would be cheaper ways to do it. Paper is the major input when you're printing a book. And so to use twice as much paper because you're printing all these dedications and prefatory poems suggests to me that those poems are actually doing something else aside from just trying to get patronage for Lanier. And so what I argue is that the publisher included these dedications because he thought that they would appeal to readers, because when you read them really carefully, they sort of welcome in an audience of women sort of outside this group of elite women that is named in the dedications themselves. But there's also a great epistle where Lanier says, I know I'm directing this book towards women. I'm also well aware that men may read it too. So I'm just asking that if you read it, read it nicely. So I felt like that Lanier case study sort of spoke to the bigger concerns of the book. And then it's just such a nice little phrase, like, thank you, Amelia Lanier.
It is a nice phrase, I agree. And I'm obsessed with that note at the end of Lanier's book, because as you say, it's an incredibly, again, think about the structure of the book, the architecture of the book, it's incredibly complicated. Over half of it are dedications to patrons, and the majority of them are women, so foregrounding female agency as patrons, women who support networks of writers, men and women. So that feels rhetorically really important. And then the long poem in that book has a quite confusing Latin title, is incredibly complicated, does all kinds of oddly pornographic things with Jesus's body. And then you read another poem which is more or less inventing the country house poem, which will be the dominant poetic form of the next 150 years, and then you finally get to this note which says, okay, everyone, you might be confused, you might be troubled as you read this book, so I'll now explain the title. The title is there because I had a dream. Okay, bye. As if that's helped us in any way whatsoever.
It's so good. I feel like I should admit at this point, because I'm talking about all the ways in which this title is very clever. I mean, I chose it, but it was also suggested to me by a friend who read the entire manuscript, who came to me with a list of 3 titles drawn from phrases I had written in the book and said, you know, there's this one, or even better, there's doubtful readers. And I went like, oh, you're right. So I'm acting like this is a very clever title, but I can't take full responsibility for it. So,
but I guess
all I can take responsibility for is like convincing the press after I signed the contract. So.
No, good job. But I guess what is interesting about it is that for both Lanya and perhaps for you as author of this new book, is that it feels quite performative, because it's kind of informing the reader that they are in doubt. And then certainly in Lanya's case, not helping them at all with that doubt, just simply reinforcing it. Like, I had a dream, that's the explanation, everything is solved now.
I'm going to conclude the next book that way.
Definitely.
My book. So like, well, that's it. That's all I have. The end.
So can you tell us a bit more about how that title then plays into this key issue you raised at the start of translating manuscript writing for a print readership? Is that
Sure.
the place in which doubt happens?
I think there are different senses of doubt at work throughout the book. I guess what I mean when I say translating from manuscript to print is that, you know, manuscript poetry was a very social form. Poetry as it circulated, lyric poetry in particular, so distinguished from, you know, the like epics or something huge like the Canterbury Tales.
Yeah.
But just when you had, you know, a short contained poem that we will call lyric, using a very broad definition of lyric, you know, it was embedded socially in lots of different ways. It was a way to sort of make friends or impress a potential partner. It was a way to sort of signal your competence if you wanted a job in the household of some prominent person. You know, you might. I've used this example with students. You know, sometimes poems worked almost like memes, where someone would write, you know, what they thought was a funny poem and hand it to their friend at university, and he'd be like, oh, I can top this, and he'd, you know, write some adaptation of that and pass it on. And so you see them kind of adapt and evolve. My students were, I don't know if they were just humoring me when I superimposed "Come live with me and be my love" on that picture of the boy shouting at the girl in the nightclub in Scotland. I think that was but you know, to me, like, early modern poetry is working very much in that social mode. But of course, when it gets printed, it doesn't take all of that context with it. You can't reproduce the, you know, oh, I'm just going to pass this to my friend, or, oh, I've sent it in a letter to, you know, this countess who I hope will give me a job. And so you have to kind of create this new context for readers to understand poems when you print them. And so that's kind of what I mean by translation. It's all the kind of apparatus, which is Roger Chartier's term, that publishers kind of put around poems to help this new print audience that may or may not have the cultural capital to sort of understand the poems on their own right. What's there to help them sort of understand and appreciate the poems. So in Lanier's case, you know, you have all those prefatory poems, kind of introducing the project of the book. You have these helpful marginal glosses throughout that long, weird narrative poem. And, you know, it keeps shifting back and forth between being a narrative and then addressing the Countess of Cumberland, but that's all helpfully flagged in the margins. Like, look, this is to the Countess of Cumberland. Okay, now this is the crucifixion, which is kind of an interesting sort of narrative arc. So that's really what the book is about. It's about trying to sort of help readers make sense of, you know, John Donne's poems that previously Donne had not wanted to circulate widely, although somehow they survive in 5 times more copies than anyone else's. You know, how do you help a reader understand these sort of weird and difficult poems? And one of the concerns that I think you really see in the Donne collection is in the 1633 first edition, Donne's friends sort of agonizing over, like, are people going to think he really did this stuff? Like, are people going to think that he seduced a woman with a flea? We better like revise this book and make sure that people understand that these are just, you know, just poems. And sure enough, the second edition of the book presents this now familiar biography of Donne, you know, moving from being this rake about town Jack to being the revered doctor. That's not a story that exists before 1635. That is entirely a creation of that edition. And it serves a specific purpose. It serves to make those doubtful or otherwise unprepared readers understand what exactly is happening in that book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And therefore that helps us think about what happens when those particular kinds of texts move from manuscript to print culture, that reception history and that idea of Donne as a kind of his gathering, developing public reputation is being driven by that shift into print. Rachel, I'm spotting a chance to segue here to Rachel. So Rachel, eventually I'm going to ask you a question about Civil War drama. That's where I'm headed. But I'm just thinking about what Erin is telling us about. I mean, what I'm hearing, and again, please do correct me, but what I'm hearing is that manuscript, Erin described it as a social form, and I'm wondering if it's almost a form of community building, community establishing and community consolidating. So both in the sense of pitched at people that you know, but also potentially, given that meme thing you were talking about, then perhaps helping you get to know even more people, but within a relatively contained social group. Whereas print is equally social, it's open to people, but it doesn't exist within those pre-existing forms of friendships and acquaintances. In other words, it's open to strangers, and that's where shifts start to occur. And I guess I'm wondering, Rachel, how that maps onto what's happening in the Civil War as we're seeing coterie performance, if that's a useful term or not. Please, again, do challenge that. And then the shift of those performances into some form of print or manuscript mediation. Yeah, do you mind giving us a sense of what's happening in the mid 17th century in relation to drama?
I think what's the curious thing about drama, print and drama in the mid 17th century is that you get the key kind of pre-Civil War plays being printed, some for the first time. So we get 1647, the Beaumont and Fletcher photo, and many of Middleton's plays are published for the first time in 1650. So we get playwrights consolidated as authors to an extent. And
these are playwrights active in the playhouses, just to unpack that.
Yeah. But we also have William Davenant, who is a really, I find a really fascinating character, not just because he married the widow of his syphilis physician, but there's a manuscript which is that's circulated, which Daniel Starr-Smith showed me from John Donne the Younger, when William Davenant was imprisoned in the 1650s. And he was imprisoned because he was heavily involved in the Royalist cause. And he was intercepted as he was travelling to Virginia, imprisoned and sentenced to death. And whilst in prison, he wrote Gondibert, which is possibly one of the worst poems in the English language. And John Donne the Younger, in this manuscript, which circulated amongst Royalists, wrote that he was imprisoned not for being an enemy of the state, but for his crimes against poetry. And so there's this kind of really clear sense of a literary community who are enjoying poetic form and enjoying sort of satire between each other, and political unrest and civil unrest. But Davenant, whilst he was in prison, also wrote a letter to Thurlow, and a couple of tracts which are basically they're framed as discussing the morality of stage and performance, but really they're kind of presenting drama as a propaganda tool. And he's then pardoned and he's the only person who is legally allowed to perform drama in the 1650s. So in 1642, the playhouses are closed, and they're closed at that point for a very sort of general reason. And they're closed because of the troubled times, as they would be closed during outbreaks of plague or any other reason that they wouldn't want a large gathering to gather together in previous times. 1647 and 1648, we get two more ordinances for theatre closure. These are far more focused upon the idea of drama being profane, and so that's where you get sort of Puritan opposition to drama coming through. And so Davenant mediates all of that, is allowed to perform dramas, but for the first time we're having his entertainments that he publishes, and they're very much sort of focused upon English national identity. We have a history of Sir Francis Drake, the cruelty of the Spaniards in Peru, which is very much kind of pushing the idea that English colonialism is better than Spanish colonialism. So they're very much kind of pushing an English expansionist sense of self in the world. And they're performed, but they're also published before being performed, which is completely the opposite of how drama was published in the early 17th century. So we're getting a new relationship, I think, between text and performance compared to what's coming before. And so the question then comes, why are they printed before? Are they printed to advertise performance? Are they printed to reach a wider audience, to continue the narrative? Are they being made public so that everyone is aware that these aren't pushing any particular agenda which the state might find difficult? Are they more aesthetic than locating them within a political framework that we're also anxious to do? So they become really sort of nebulous texts, which are quite complicated to unpack, but there is definitely a different relationship, I think. But I wonder to the extent to which, because there's one text from 1667, The Change of Crowns, which was Edward Howe's play, which was first performed in 1667 to great applause. Then it was watched by Charles II and angered him so much that Robert Lacey, who played one of the key parts, was imprisoned in the Porter's Lodge of the Tower of London. And there's a slight joke there as well, actually, because the passages which are believed to have angered Charles II all revolved around a character ended up being locked in the Porter's Lodge. So it sort of mirrors the punishment mirrors the performance. And the manuscript exists in the Folger, Shakespeare Library, but no edition was published during the 17th century, and it was only published in the 20th century. So there's a sense of suppression, and where does a manuscript sit in relation to suppressed forms? Because obviously print is regulated far more than manuscript circulation is.
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. Rachel, I'm wondering if we might have lost Erin. So I'm going to stop the conversation and reopen a Zoom window and see if we can get back to her. You've suddenly started moving again. Okay, great, perfect. You were frozen for just a moment, but we have you back. That's brilliant. So yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. Yeah, this question of publishing before performance, as you say, a reversal of what we expect to see from the culture of the playhouses and also of drama before the playhouses as well, and the regulation of print. Print is both a more public but also a more regulatable form, because you just need an awful lot more equipment to print something than to write it out by hand. Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think we should aim to draw towards a close now. I wanted to make sure we left time to talk about the Society for Renaissance Studies, and I should make clear that we first thought we would bring the two of you together because the Society for Renaissance Studies responded to lockdown by hosting these brilliant events, including book launches. And I believe the first one, right, was for Erin's Doubtful Readers, quite right too. Rachel, do you mind telling us a little bit about the Society for Renaissance Studies? Just briefly give our listeners a sense of of the work that you do in that body, or what the body itself does?
Sure. Well, yeah, Erin very kindly was our guinea pig as we tried to work out how we would function in this new strange space which we now occupy. But yeah, I mean, the Society for Renaissance Studies is the main body in the United Kingdom and Ireland that for the study of the Renaissance, sort of broadly defined. So for our American colleagues, we're sort of like the Renaissance Society of America's baby cousin, and we do quite a lot of work, particularly in supporting early career researchers with fellowships and conference grants, and to try and make things a little bit easier in that respect. The online platform was basically our response to how can we keep conversations going during lockdown, rather like a bit lit is a response. And basically, if anybody has an event which they want to put on, get in touch with me, we can talk about possibilities.
Great, thank you, and thank you for all the work you and the SRS have been doing to support scholars during this very strange time. It's really appreciated.
And I should say, you shouldn't overstate my kindness. Like, I had just found out that my face-to-face launch was going to have to be canceled because it was supposed to be at RSA. So when you came to me with this opportunity, I thought that was very kind. I think I told you that it made me tear up a little. So thank you.
Erin was so brilliant managing the questions, and she made the whole thing look so effortless that
and it was 6:30 in the morning, and I had champagne anyway. So
wow, thank you. We're ending these films by asking the potentially very loaded and weird question of what the word literature means to you, and you're welcome to answer professionally or personally, but I'm really interested in where it sits in people's vocabulary and whether it's a useful term to them or a term that gets in the way of what they want to do. Feel free to interpret it any way you want to. Maybe we'll start with Rachel, if that's all right.
I absolutely loathe the word. It's I'm not quite sure what it does in a way, because it presents text and reading as very established, very canonized, very cut off periodically. So it kind of goes against all the ways in which I like to engage in what text is. So I much rather think in terms of text and reading than I do about literature, because of just wanting to break down all the ways in which the discipline has developed over time, and that to me is what literature embodies.
Yeah, thank you. Erin?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a really strong emotional reaction to the term, but it's interesting because I have this notion of my work as being sort of hyper interdisciplinary. You know, it draws from literary studies and history and now digital methods, and yet I hear a lot that, you know, it is very literary, which actually is probably fair, because I'm deploying all of this other evidence, you know, in service of, you know, as I say in the first book, you know, formalist readings of poems. So I think I'm a little bit resistant to the sort of belletristic sense of literature, which, as Rachel says, you know, kind of locks you into this very canonical mode of reading. And I promise you, some of these poems that I'm reading right now are not like aesthetically pleasing objects that are going to end up on anyone's reading list ever. But at the same time, I also don't want to abandon this sense that there is something special about poetry as it's distinguished from prose, or you know, that I don't terribly miss teaching Paradise Lost and just having these moments of like, look at how good this enjambment is, like, look at it, please tell me you understand, and just having, you know, 200 undergraduates look at me like, are you nuts? Why are you so excited about a line break? But I mean, maybe we just need a better word.
Yeah,
but there is some special magic to some of these texts, I think.
I'm now wondering if perhaps we need to reclaim literature from the way in which it's being constructed. And I mean, I love teaching Paradise Lost for precisely that reason. Every time I return to the text, I'm finding myself picking up new things, and but yeah, I'm now wondering if maybe, because in a way I think one of the joys of literary studies is how nebulous it is, that we can borrow from social theory, we can borrow from historiography, we can borrow from musicology, so yeah, I guess the question is, it becomes a way of engaging with culture, and a way of engaging with words and playing with words, and that's quite exciting, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there is something there, and I mean, I don't think this is ever going to be a defense of the field in sort of the current climate, but I mean, there is something to these texts, as some of them anyway, about being things that really exist primarily for pleasure or leisure, or they're things that are sort of outside kind of a purely, market driven or scientific, or like some of these things just exist because they're beautiful and they have to.
Yeah.
And I don't know what we do with that, because that's I can't go to the Australian government now and say, like, no, you can't charge double for the humanities. They're beautiful. But
and I think one of the really brilliant things about the early modern period is that we don't get that sense of here's STEM, here's shape, or whatever you want to call the humanities. There's a sense of a symbiotic relationship, and that they're speaking to each other, and I would love that to return in our discussions, rather than keeping these two separate ways of thinking about the world.
Yeah, although, I mean, the thing I pick up from that conversation you just had, which was completely fascinating, is that the early modern period does still canonize and valorize certain kinds of pleasure and leisure and beauty. And I second everything Erin's saying about wanting to champion those things, but we also tend to politicize and police what people are allowed to find pleasurable, leisurable, that's just a word I've invented, or beautiful. So I think it's celebrating the aesthetic and sensory pleasure of these texts and words and sounds, but also attending to the ways in which we exist in cultures and we inherit past cultures, which are incredibly bossy, discriminatory, censorious, and sometimes just actively destructive of the ways in which we respond to those things. That feels like a really negative way to end, but I'm excited. I'm excited by challenging those things. Just to be clear.
Yes, and to be clear, I am not advocating for some return to a male canon or I mean, I think my time on research does not bear that out. But yeah, some of those texts are absolutely gorgeous too, like Mary Roth, or like, yeah. I sound very old-fashioned. I should probably just stop.
No, you don't. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to imply you sounding old-fashioned at all. And I share the interests you're describing. I suppose it's just thinking about how those ideas have been co-opted and still can be.
It's hard because they've been co-opted, and yet, where does abdicating them take us?
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, because then if everything has to become instrumental.
I think it's a case of understanding the beauty whilst also the difficulties.
And I think that's where some of my work on complexity. I didn't mean to talk over you, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think that's some of where our work on sort of materiality helps in maybe a small way, but sort of looking at the way these things are situated in sort of structures of power, in economic systems, the things that survive are to a certain extent dictated by, who was connected enough to have things circulate widely, who had a country house where their manuscript would survive for a few hundred years. And so I think we can think critically about those factors and about, the stories that leaves us with, and the texts that gives us now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if it's okay to wrap up on that note, I think the things that survive is a very helpful phrase, but I'd like to say thank you to both of you, because you're also people who challenge our sense of what has survived, because it's not just survival, it's also then the reception and the active noticing and responses to the things that survive. So in the quantitative work that Erin described at the outset of the film, in an attention to things which disappear through periodization that Rachel was telling us about in connection to Civil War drama, those are really fine examples, I think, of how we can have, we can have active responses to things that survive. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a real pleasure learning more about your work, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good day.